Turned into a grenade.
All right. Starting tonight, we get back to the book of Revelation. Now, before anybody gets too terribly excited, though, there will be some other excursions along the way, because before we're done with Revelation, we will look at some other passages in the Gospel, and we're going to spend some time in Ezekiel. But for right now, for the next, I'd say about 4 or 5 chapters, we're going to be in Revelation, and we are going to pick up with chapter 13. Chapter 13 is probably going to take us at least a couple of weeks to dig through. This is the focal chapter that a lot of people kind of get wrapped around the axle about. Tonight we're going to try to cover these first 10 verses. Chapter 13 is divided into 2 parts. First 10 verses describe the Antichrist. Beginning in verse 11, the rest of it describes the false prophet. Now, I know there's at least one commentator out there that thinks, no, the first 10 verses is the false prophet and the second part is the Antichrist. His view is definitely in the minority, and I think definitely is wrong, which we'll see as we continue on, and you'll see why. Now, before we get into this, you're going to see, beginning in this first part of chapter 13, one of the reasons that we have spent so much time studying the visions of Daniel. Also, as a reminder, in Daniel, when he described a beast, what was he talking about?
Kingdom.
A kingdom. However, in Revelation, the term beast has 2 meanings. When you refer to a kingdom, what else often do you mean?
Government.
Well, not just the government, but when you talk about, let's say, in England, when somebody refers to the crown, the term the crown can stand for 2 things. You can either be talking about the country as a whole,
Or the king.
or the king himself. Because when you are the king, you are the country. You follow what I'm getting at with that? That's been a staple of political systems for hundreds of years. That when you have a royalty, when there's a throne, the individual on the throne, and the country are all considered one and the same. That's an important point to consider when we get to Revelation. So far in Daniel, every time Daniel described a beast, it was very clear in his own explanation that these beasts were kingdoms. However, even in Daniel, he gave a tip of the hat to the other possibility. For example, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, this Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar called Daniel in. Of course, he'd already, issued a execution order for all the so-called soothsayers and fortune tellers. Well, when Daniel comes in, he interprets the dream for him and says, well, the first part, because you recall, just as a reminder, Nebuchadnezzar saw this great statue, gold on the top, a breast of silver, midsection of bronze, and then legs of iron. Well, as Daniel began to describe these 4 kingdoms, for example, at the very top, he didn't say, well, the head is Babylon. What did he tell Nebuchadnezzar?
You're the head.
You're the head. Absolutely. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire were basically one and the same in this vision. He said, you, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head. We're going to see the same thing here as we get into Revelation. Now, by the way, one other point I want to make. That vision that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and then later Daniel had a vision of his own. Babylon was the first one, correct? What was the national symbol of Babylon? Does anybody remember?
Oh, that was the winged lion.
A lion, absolutely, a winged lion. What was the national symbol of the Medo-Persian Empire?
Bear.
A bear. The third one was the Greek Empire. What were they?
Leopard.
The leopard. Keep that in mind. We're going to see it again in just a few seconds. Chapter 13 of Revelation. And he stood, by the way, when it says he, this first part of verse 1 actually should have gone with verse 17 of the previous chapter. In fact, let me go back and read. This is verse 17 of chapter 12. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring, who kept the commandments of God, and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the seashore. You can see right there in that context, the he that Daniel is talking about goes back to the dragon of chapter 12. Now, once again, as a reminder, where we have chapters and verse divisions, did Daniel write his book with chapter and verse divisions? No, that was added centuries later. So keep that in mind, that just because you see the end of a chapter in the Bible or a verse does not mean anything. That wasn't there when they first wrote it.
So the first part of 13 should be the last part of 12, which shouldn't be 12.
Pretty much. Now, that
You got
doesn't
mad at
mean
me
we
last time I said
well,
that.
it doesn't mean we ignore that. It just this is the tie-in, so that as we get deeper into chapter 13, you understand what this is all talking about. So we're talking about the dragon, which of course, who's the dragon?
Satan.
The devil, absolutely, Satan. Now, the remainder of verse 1 says, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. Well, it was the devil who's standing there looking over the sea. And he says, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. Now, where have we seen a beast with 10 horns and 7 heads before?
Daniel.
Daniel, absolutely. And once again, Daniel has already given us the interpretation of this. It is a kingdom that would arise in the latter days. Guess what? Revelation, we're now in the latter days. So this is the kingdom that Daniel told everybody about 2,500 years before. But in this case, he's got 10 horns, 7 heads. Now, in that vision of Daniel and what we're now seeing emerging, coming up out of the sea, as a reminder, what were the 10 horns? Daniel told us this.
10 kings.
10 kings or 10 kingdoms, either way you look at it. And it has 7 heads. Well, do you remember in the vision Daniel saw, he saw an 11th horn come up later, and what did the 11th horn do to 3 of the other 10?
Destroyed them.
Uprooted them. Well, what's 10 minus 3? 10 horns and 7 heads. What's happened here is what John is now describing are the 10 kingdoms that Daniel has told us about, minus 3 kings. We're missing 3 kings. And on his horn were 10 diadems. By the way, normally, what we have seen in the past when we see a reference to a crown, remember I told you there's 2 words in the original Greek for crown. One is a Stephanos, which we get the name Stephen from. What was a Stephanos? Does anybody remember?
Royalty.
You got it backwards. The Stephanos was a crown, a victor's crown. That's what we're going to get when we stand before the judgment seat and God says, I'm going to give each of us a crown. We're getting a Stephanos, a victor's crown. The other word, diadema, which we get the word diadem, that's a crown of royalty. Notice here, these horns have on them 10 crowns of royalty. So we're talking about not just a victor's crown, but definitely 10 kings. 10 kings, of which out of that 3 heads are missing. On his heads, blasphemous names. By the way, I did a little research. Let me find my little paper here. There's still at this point a lot of speculation as to the potential revived Roman Empire. We know that from the description of Daniel that this fourth empire is going to be a remaking or a holdover of the Roman Empire from 2,000 years ago. Although you recall in Daniel's vision, or actually I should say Nebuchadnezzar's vision, that Roman Empire, the iron part, said was 2 legs. Where do we get the 2 legs in the Roman Empire?
Rome and Byzantine.
There you go. You remember, if you have forgotten from your world history, the Roman Empire got divided into 2 parts, an eastern and a western. The Western Empire's capital was Rome, and the Eastern capital was Constantinople, which today we call what?
Istanbul.
Istanbul. And even today, the church, you've got the Pope with the Catholic Church in Rome, and you've got the Orthodox Church in Istanbul. Still that way. But what's more interesting about that is you continue down on Nebuchadnezzar's little statue there, you had 10 toes.
Of clay.
Of clay, yeah. It was a divided empire. Not only you got 10 toes there, which we're seeing here represented now by 10 horns, but it wasn't a unified empire. Not like the earlier part of the Roman Empire that was solid iron. Now we've got there's some fracturing going on here. Now, I did a little bit of research on this, and out of the EU, the European Union, which is, of course, the economic confederation in Europe at this point, that for the most part, there's a few exceptions here and there. For example, I think Denmark is one of them. Denmark was not originally a part of the Roman Empire. But in those countries that now make up the European Union, I found it rather interesting that only 7 of the countries that currently make up the European Union have a royal family. 3 of those have what's called principalities. In other words, they don't have a king, they have a prince. Just like in Monaco. Everybody remember who Grace Kelly was back years ago?
Yeah.
And she married the Prince of Monaco, because Monaco doesn't have a king, they've got a prince. So they're called a principality, but they do still have a royal family. So out of that, you have, out of the European Union, 10 countries that have a royal family. Only 7 of the 10 have kings, or queens, which were Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the UK. Of course, the UK has now pulled out. Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, and then you have what's called a Grand Duchy, which basically means they don't even have a prince, they got a duke, which is Luxembourg. So, I'm not going to tell you that based on, especially now that the UK has pulled out of the European Union, I can't tell you for sure that, yeah, that's the fulfillment of it, but there's definitely the possibility of the makings of that, because, of course, we know that politics changes with the weather. By the time the Antichrist surfaces, however many more years from now that is, there's no telling what shape this is going to take. But we can certainly see how that could be fulfilled in that. But, now the other thing, and I'm going to give you a little fast forward in this. Look to verse 11. I don't want to go into detail about this at this point because we're going to cover that in detail later on. But just verse 11, notice it says, "And I saw another beast coming up out of the earth." Notice in verse 1, John says he sees his first beast coming up out of the sea. Verse 11, when he sees the second beast, he's coming up out of the earth. Now, there's two ways to look at this. In prophecy, most of the time when you see a reference to something arising out of the sea, what do we see the sea as?
People.
People. That's the first possibility. The second possibility is a lot of times when something arises out of the sea, not only because of the people, it's arising from an area that is currently populated. As opposed to when the United States arose 50 years ago, North America, while there were some people here, was generally a vast land of very, very few people. When something comes up out of the land, in biblical prophecy, again, two ways to look at that. The one that I just alluded to was when something arises out of an area where there are no people. The second possibility, in many cases, to distinguish between the Jews and the Gentiles, a lot of times you'll see various biblical passages refer to the land of the Gentiles, where the nations, the people are, as the sea. Does anybody want to take a wild bet or a guess here as to what the Bible sometimes refers to something arising out of Israel?
Rising out of the earth.
Out of the land or out of the earth. Israel is referred to as the land. There's the land, and everywhere else is the sea. There's basically my people and the people everywhere else. Notice in verse 1, he sees his first beast coming up out of the sea. Verse 11, he sees it coming up out of the land. For that reason, many commentators believe, and again, at this point in history, we have no way of knowing. All we can do is speculate, because we haven't gotten far enough into the fulfillment of any of this to know. And when the Antichrist does appear, and we can say, see, there, that was how it was supposed to be interpreted. When that time comes, we won't care. But I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't plan to be here. If any of you are, good luck to you. You better run hide. All right. For that reason, a lot of people believe this beast referred to in the first part of the chapter is going to be a Gentile. Now, having said that, just as a reminder, in these visions and in this prophecy, beast sometimes refers to the nation or to a kingdom. Other times it refers to the leader, the king. And in this case, in this beast, one of the reasons we know here in John is more talking about the leader of the empire than he is the empire itself. The reason we know that is because if we fast forward to, I think it's chapter 20, when Jesus comes back, both these beasts, the false prophet and the Antichrist, chapter 20 tells us that they are immediately judged and thrown alive into the lake of fire. If they are judged and thrown alive into the lake of fire, guess what? We're talking about a person. This is not just a kingdom. We're talking about the leader of that kingdom.
So is this interpretation of Israel representing the land pointing toward the false prophet being a Jew?
That was the second part of what I was going to get to. That's why I'm saying that a lot of commentators believe the Antichrist will be a Gentile and the false prophet will be a Jew. Now, I can't tell you for sure at this point that that is indeed going to be the case. I'm just telling you that that is the interpretation of quite a few commentators on this book. And there is strong evidence to indicate that. But having said that, let's continue on. Verse 2. And the beast which I saw. Now notice as he describes it, John is more describing this as an empire, but once again, empire, the kingdom and the king are often seen as one and the same. The beast which I saw was like a leopard. Now who was the leopard? Greece. And his feet were like those of a bear. Medo-Persian. And his mouth like the mouth of a lion, Babylon. The dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. Why in this passage do you think John would take this beast and describe him as a conglomeration of all of these? Anybody want to take a guess?
It has characteristics or history in there. There's something common to that.
There you go. This empire that will arise in the latter days will include territory that will encompass all three of those ancient kingdoms. And as Bruce just mentioned, there will be characteristics of all of these. What were the Babylonians known for?
Tower of Babel?
Not just the Tower of Babel, but militarily, for example.
They were brutal.
They were brutal. There's number one. What were the Medo-Persians known for? They expanded the territory and even more brutal than the Babylonians. And then the Greek Empire,
Quick and tactical.
they conquered all of the known world in just a matter of months. What you're going to see here is this coming empire is going to be overwhelmingly brutal, and it's going to come to fruition in a very short period of time. You're going to see elements of all three in this coming kingdom. All right, back to verse 2. It says, and the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. So just like in our study of Isaiah, where it talks about the power behind the throne. Well, as this empire grows, what John has just told us is that the devil himself is the one. He is the one pulling the strings. He is the power behind the throne. By the way, as this comes to fruition in the first half of the tribulation, where is the devil during that period of time?
He's still in heaven, or has access.
He still has access to heaven because we're still during the period of judgment. Because from our earlier study about a couple of chapters, just the previous chapter, chapter 12, the devil got thrown out of heaven at the midpoint of the tribulation because at that point, judgment is over. Now that's an important point to kind of keep in the back of your hat for right now. Because as the Antichrist comes to power, what we're going to see, now we're not going to get to that in these first 10 verses, but we will see that before this chapter is over with. The Antichrist is going to suffer a fatal wound. Now, let me even stop here and tackle this subject at this point. This fatal wound, does anybody want to take a wild guess what kind of wound it's going to be?
Head wound.
Wound in the head.
It's a head wound. How do we know it's going to be a head wound?
Because it says so in the next verse.
It did.
Because it's a volatile area. It's
All
not
right,
covered.
all right. Here we go. Let me throw a rock on the table for you. Without referring to the book of Revelation at all, how do we know it's going to be a head wound?
Well, it's fatal.
Because that's where your
It's
brains
fatal
are.
and
No,
it's open, it's available.
nope.
Can be seed.
Straight out of Scripture, folks.
Can be seed.
All the way back to the book of Genesis, when Adam
The
and Eve
serpent's going to bruise
sinned.
his heel and he's going to crush the serpent's head.
Thank you, right there. This was prophesied all the way back in the Garden of Eden. Christ, when he was crucified, those spikes in his feet were not in fact, we talked about this on the way to lunch here just, what was a week or so ago. When you see pictures of a crucifixion or a depiction of that, and it shows Christ having the nail through the top of his foot, folks, that is not biblical. Absolutely not biblical. I'll take two reasons. Number one, Isaiah tells us, well, is it Isaiah? No, it's a Psalm. I forget which one. But I'm sure all of you will recognize it when I tell you this. It says that when Jesus was crucified, not a single bone in his body was broken. Folks, if you know anything at all about human anatomy and the skeleton, you can't put a spike through the top of a man's foot and not break a bone. Those bones in your feet are very close together. You put a spike through there, something's going to break. The Bible says Jesus didn't have any broken bones. But again, you go back to that passage in Genesis, it says it would bruise his heel. Those spikes were nailed between his Achilles tendon and the heel bone. That's where he got nailed to the cross, at least on his feet. Bruised his heel. But, Merrill just mentioned, God went on to tell Adam and Eve, says, but he will bruise his head. The fatal head wound of the Antichrist was prophesied from the very beginning of time. And as we get back into chapter 13 here, we'll see that in fact the Antichrist will be assassinated by an apparent head wound. Well, when the devil gets kicked out of heaven at the midpoint of the tribulation, well, we've already seen from chapter 12, he's mad. And he wants to cause some devilment. Pun intended. If the Antichrist, who is the devil's main man, because if the devil is busy accusing Christians, before the throne of God, well, he's got the Antichrist doing his bidding here on earth at that point. But lo and behold, at about the midpoint of the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to get assassinated with a head wound. In fact, it says he will die from a sword. Well, people don't use swords anymore. So what do you think would fulfill the concept of a head wound with a sword with today's technology?
Bullet.
A bullet. Because today's version of the modern day sword is this. By the way, I am not saying that Donald Trump is the Antichrist. He doesn't qualify, for any of those of you who are wondering.
He didn't apparently die.
Yeah, that's one thing. First off, I think Donald Trump's too old. Secondly, he did not die of this head wound. But I think it's going to be something similar to this. Somebody's going to shoot the Antichrist in the head. And he's going to, die. Well, the devil being what the devil likes to do, which is to fake or copy everything that God does. Well, if the devil's just gotten kicked out of heaven, and we do know already from the Bible that demons can in fact possess human bodies, how do you think the devil is going to fake a resurrection?
Well, he could inhabit the body of the Antichrist and reanimate it.
There you go. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. And I'm not the only one that thinks that. That is, in fact, what most knowledgeable commentators think is going to take place. That the Antichrist is going to be assassinated at some point in the midpoint of the tribulation. That the devil, seeking to fool whoever he can fool, is going to possess this dead body and make it appear as though, I've been revived from the dead. Well, if the world, knowing that this great world leader has just been assassinated, and I'm sure probably about, maybe 2 or 3 days later, he appears to come to life. then what we see beginning in verse 11, which I'm going to give you a little heads up on chapter, or the rest of the chapter beginning verse 11, the false prophet is going to demand that the world worship the beast. Well, he's not going to have to do too much demanding, because they will have just seen, for the world to see on the internet, on TV, or whatever, that this man who just a couple of days before was assassinated is now alive again. He must be what?
God.
God. And that will open the door for him to march himself into the temple in Jerusalem and say, you can do away with all of this other worship, because guess what? I'm God. And people are going to believe him. Everybody except those who know better. All right, let's continue. Get at least a few more verses out of the way before we run out of time here. Verse 3. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. Well, why shouldn't they be amazed? Because somebody that they knew had just been assassinated is now apparently alive again. And they worshipped the dragon, because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him? All right, we'll stop there at that point, because this is then John kind of flipping back and forth between describing the beast as the Antichrist versus the kingdom of the Antichrist. Because when he says, who's able to make war with him? Well, what would that be talking about? The Antichrist himself, or the empire that he is now the head of?
The empire.
The empire. Because what we saw in the earlier fact in our study of Daniel, what did we see as the one thing that the Antichrist seems to enjoy more than anything else? And does he worship?
War.
War. Power and war. So what you're going to see, and this is where the characteristics of the Greek Empire come into play. This empire is going to spread out and take over the known world in a very short period of time, possibly a matter of months. And he's going to be so powerful that people are going to say, as now that this risen leader is at the helm, it's like, well, he must be God, we'll worship him, and we certainly can't make war with him, because, well, who can make war against this? And he will probably by that time have a nuclear arsenal at his disposal that probably encompasses that of several countries. Yeah.
Everyone that gets shot in the head with a bullet doesn't die. But you cut someone's head off with a sword, they're dead.
Yeah, but we know this is going to be a lethal shot, because in verse 3 it even says his fatal wound. It refers to him as being fatal. So the Bible tells us he's going to be dead.
Thinking that Muslims decapitate everyone with a sword.
That's coming.
And just think,
I'll give you a quick heads up.
okay.
The Bible tells us as we continue on, and we'll see this in the latter part of chapter 13, the part that when we're studying about the false prophet, says all those who refuse to worship the beast are executed. Guess by what method they're executed.
Yeah, beheaded.
Which is also one of the reasons, by the way, folks, that I think that Islam is going to definitely be the world religion by that point, because we have already seen what is Islam's preferred method of execution.
Beheading.
On your
Beheading.
decapitated.
And a very brutally decapitation at that. All right. Well, we've gotten as far as, let's see, verse 4. We'll pick up there on Sunday evening. And we'll go on into the second part of this if we have time. But like I said, this is not going to be a fast part of the chapter. But again, a quick heads up. Part of what we're going to be studying when we get to the second half of chapter 13 is the introduction of the mark of the beast. And I know all of you in here wondering, what's that going to look like? Well, none of us know for sure, but I will, and a couple of you in here, or maybe 3 or 4 of you, might remember we studied this over at Hardytown, although by this point you may have forgotten what that was about. The rest of you just probably scratching your head. And again, I'm not going to tell you at this point that I know what the mark of the beast is. But I can give you a real good idea of what I believe it very well could be. And we'll study that before we're done with chapter 13 here. Which again, where that comes from, Islam. Questions so far this evening?
I don't have a question, but you remember when we were talking about the 1260 days of Daniel and the 1290 days, and I just kind of came across something. I know someone said that there are no coincidences in the Bible. But
Somebody said that.
yeah, but the thing is that Bonnie and I were rereading Revelation, and in the first, I don't know, chapter or 2, it talks about the Jews mourning the one that they had pierced, and that's Zechariah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was worrying about mourning. You know, there's 30 days in there. Do Jews have a 30-day mourning period? And they mourned 30 days for Moses. So it just helps me put things together, maybe help remember it.
Mm-hmm.
But it just seems to me that that's pretty convenient, that there's a 30-day period in there where the Jews could actually mourn for what they have done. Because, I mean, they had the last 2,000 years of being chased from one end of the planet to the other. They've actually are responsible in part for crucifying Christ, and they've rejected him for 2,000 years. And they just might need a few days to kind of wrap their head around this thing that's happening with Jesus coming back and the whole thing. But it just helps me fit the stuff together. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But it just
Well,
helps
you
me.
said it yourself. No such thing as a coincidence in the Bible.
So anyway, I just thought it was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You said the lion was what country?
The winged lion is Babylon. Anybody else? All right.